The gunshot that blasted through the quiet streets of Willowcreek, Arizona Territory, in 1875, changed Lillian Kincaid's life forever. She clutched her side and collapsed against the dusty boardwalk, blood seeping through her fingers as chaos erupted around her. The bank robbery hadn't been meant for her, she'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. A mail-order bride arriving to meet a husband who never showed. As darkness crept into the edges of her vision, a pair of weathered boots appeared before her, and strong arms lifted her from the ground. "Stay with me, miss," a deep voice commanded, and it was the last thing Lillian remembered before the world went black. Dr. Peterson's grim face greeted her when she finally awoke 3 days later in the town's small infirmary. "The bullet did considerable damage, Miss Kincaid," he explained, not bothering to soften his words. "I managed to save your life, but I'm afraid you'll never bear children. The damage to your womb was extensive." Lillian stared at the ceiling, tears sliding silently down her temples. 22 years old and already half a woman. What man would want her now? The husband who hadn't bothered to meet her train certainly wouldn't once he learned of her condition. Her future, already uncertain, now seemed bleaker than the desert surrounding this God-forsaken town. "Where will you go?" the doctor asked when she was well enough to leave his care a week later. "I don't know," Lillian admitted, clutching the small carpet bag containing all her worldly possessions. "My intended, Mr. Blackburn, never came for me." Dr. Peterson's face softened. "Blackburn's claim was overrun by Apaches 2 days before your arrival. I'm sorry, miss. News travels slow out here." Another loss to add to her growing collection. Parents dead from influenza, a brother lost to the war, and now this. Lillian squared her shoulders despite the pain still lingering in her side. "Is there work in town for a woman who can read and write? I was a teacher back east." "The saloon's always hiring girls," he suggested, then quickly added when he saw her expression, "for serving drinks and such. Or perhaps Mrs. Whittaker at the general store could use help. She's getting on in years." Lillian thanked him and stepped into the harsh sunlight, momentarily blinded after days in the dim infirmary. When her vision cleared, she found herself staring at a tall figure leaning against a hitching post. "Miss Kincaid," he said, tipping his hat. "Marshal Matthew Fletcher. I was hoping you'd recovered enough for a conversation." She recognized him instantly, the man who'd carried her to the doctor, his shirt becoming soaked with her blood. His face was tanned and weathered from years under the Arizona sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he squinted. Dark hair peeked from beneath his hat, and a badge gleamed on his chest. "The men who shot you are in custody," he explained. "They'll hang for murder and robbery next month." "Murder?" Lillian asked. "Bank teller didn't make it," he said grimly. "I need your account of what happened, if you're feeling up to it." Lillian nodded, and he guided her to a bench outside the town's small jailhouse. As she recounted the events, how she just stepped from the stagecoach when gunfire erupted from the bank, his eyes never left her face. There was something disarming about his attention, the way he listened as though her words actually mattered. "And you've nowhere to go now?" he asked when she finished her account. Lillian lifted her chin. "I'll manage, Marshal. I always have." He seemed to consider something before speaking again. "My sister runs a boarding house on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, but the rooms are clean, and she could use help with the cooking and cleaning. Might be a place for you to stay until you decide what's next." The offer was unexpected but welcome. "I'd be grateful for the introduction," Lillian said. Marshal Fletcher's sister, Rebecca, was a whirlwind of efficiency with a kind smile that didn't quite reach her wary eyes. The boarding house was indeed clean but worn around the edges, housing mostly miners and cowboys passing through. A room in exchange for help with meals and laundry seemed a fair arrangement, and Lillian accepted it gratefully. That night, as she settled into her small room beneath the eaves, Lillian allowed herself to cry for everything she'd lost: her family, her intended husband, and now her ability to bear children. In a territory where a woman's worth was often measured by the sons she could provide, what future remained for her? Life at the boarding house fell into a predictable rhythm. Lillian rose before dawn to help with breakfast, spent mornings cleaning rooms and afternoons preparing dinner. The work was hard but honest, and Rebecca proved to be a fair employer, if somewhat distant. The Marshal visited regularly, ostensibly to check on his sister, but his eyes often followed Lillian as she moved about the dining room. 3 weeks after she began working at the boarding house, Mrs. Whittaker from the general store approached her after Sunday services. "I hear you've got some schooling," the older woman said without preamble. "Can you keep accounts?" "Yes, madam," Lillian replied. "I managed my father's household books after my mother passed." Mrs. Whittaker nodded decisively. "My eyes aren't what they used to be. Come by tomorrow morning. If you can make sense of my ledgers, there might be work for you." The next day, Lillian found herself seated at a small desk in the back of Whittaker's general store, methodically organizing months of chaotic bookkeeping. By midday, she had unraveled enough of the mess to determine that Mrs. Whittaker was owed nearly $200 in outstanding debts from various townspeople. "Well," Mrs. Whittaker said, examining Lillian's neat columns of figures, "seems I've been more generous than I thought. Can you come 3 mornings a week? I'll pay 50 cents a day." It wasn't much, but combined with her room and board at Rebecca's, it would allow Lillian to start saving again. Perhaps in time, she could afford to travel somewhere else, somewhere no one knew her or the emptiness she carried inside. As summer heat baked the territory, Lillian's days fell into a new pattern: mornings at the store, afternoons and evenings at the boarding house. Her body healed, though sometimes the scar pulled when she bent to scrub floors or carried heavy baskets of laundry. The physical pain was manageable. It was the knowledge of what she'd lost that hurt most deeply. One evening in late July, as Lillian hung washing on the line behind the boarding house, Marshal Fletcher appeared, leading his horse. "Evening, Miss Kincaid," he said, removing his hat. His dark hair was damp with sweat and dust covered his clothes. "Just got back from tracking cattle rustlers. Rebecca around?" "She went to deliver a meal to Mr. Peterson. His wife's taken ill," Lillian explained, pinning a sheet to the line. "You look like you could use some supper yourself, Marshal," he smiled, and those lines appeared at the corners of his eyes. "Matthew," he corrected. "After pulling a bullet out of you, I reckon we can use given names." Lillian felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the evening sun. "There's stew on the stove, Matthew. Help yourself. I'll be in once I finish here." He nodded and led his horse to the small stable, and Lillian found herself watching the way he moved, confident but not arrogant, strength evident in every step. She quickly looked away when he glanced back and caught her staring. Inside, she found him at the kitchen table, a bowl of stew before him and a piece of corn bread in his hand. "Rebecca's cooking has improved," he commented as she poured herself a cup of coffee. "Actually, I made the stew," Lillian admitted, sitting across from him. "Rebecca doesn't mind me experimenting with the meals sometimes." Matthew took another bite, chewing thoughtfully. "My compliments, then. Best meal I've had in days." "Better than trail rations, I imagine," she said, warming her hands on the coffee cup. "Considerably." He studied her for a moment. "You're looking well. Settling in all right?" "Yes, thank you. Between here and the store, I'm keeping busy." "Heard you straightened out Widow Whittaker's books. Half the town's grumbling about getting collection notices." Lillian smiled slightly. They should pay their debts. Matthew laughed, a rich sound that filled the kitchen. Don't I know it? Town marshal doesn't get paid regular neither. He sobered, setting down his spoon. Heard something else, too, about what the doc told you. Lillian's smile vanished and she stared into her coffee. Of course word had spread. In a town this size, nothing remained private for long. I'm sorry, he said quietly. That's a heavy burden for anyone to carry. It changes things, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Plans, dreams, what a woman can hope for. Some men don't care about such things, Matthew said, and when she looked up, his eyes held hers with unexpected intensity. Most do, Lillian countered. Especially out here, where sons are needed to work the land. Before he could respond, the front door opened and Rebecca's voice called out. The moment whatever it had been passed, and Matthew rose to greet his sister. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Lillian found herself thinking about the marshal's words. Some men don't care about such things. Was he speaking of himself? The thought sent a flutter through her chest that she quickly suppressed. It wouldn't do to develop feelings for a man who might want a whole woman someday, no matter what he claimed now. August brought scorching heat and a drought that stressed both livestock and tempers. Fights broke out more frequently at the saloon, keeping Matthew busy most nights. Lillian saw him less often, though occasionally she'd catch sight of him riding through town, tall and straight in the saddle. One particularly hot afternoon, as Lillian updated Mrs. Whittaker's ledger, the store's bell jangled. Looking up, she saw a young woman enter, perhaps a year or two younger than herself, with a baby balanced on her hip. "Can I help you?" Lillian asked, setting aside her pen. "I need thread and buttons," the woman said, bouncing the fussing infant. "And maybe a moment's peace. Levy here hasn't stopped crying all morning." Lillian smiled and stood. "May I?" she asked, holding out her arms. The woman looked surprised but handed over the baby gratefully. "You have a way with children. I used to help with the little ones at church functions back home," Lillian explained, cradling the infant against her shoulder and swaying gently. The baby hiccuped once, then settled. "Well, I'll be," the woman said, watching in amazement. "I'm Laura Jennings, by the way. My husband's the new blacksmith, Lillian Kincaid. I work here and at Fletcher's boarding house." As Laura gathered her supplies, they chatted easily. When she mentioned needing someone to mind the baby occasionally while she helped her husband at the forge, Lillian surprised herself by volunteering. "I couldn't pay much," Laura warned. "I don't need much," Lillian replied, still holding the now sleeping infant. Just the company would be payment enough. It wasn't a lie. As she handed little Levy back to his mother, something tight in Lillian's chest loosened slightly. Perhaps she couldn't have children of her own, but that didn't mean she couldn't know the joy of holding a baby or watching a child grow. That evening, as Lillian served dinner to the boarders, she noticed Matthew enter and take his usual place at the end of the table. He looked tired, a new cut above his right eyebrow and bruised knuckles suggesting he'd broken up another fight. After the meal, when the other boarders had retired to the parlor for cards or reading, Lillian brought a damp cloth and sat beside him at the now empty table. "Hold still," she instructed, reaching for his forehead. He looked startled but obeyed, wincing slightly as she cleaned the cut. "It's nothing serious," he protested. "It'll scar if it's not tended properly," she countered. "Who was it this time? Johnson Brothers, fighting over water rights again." He watched her face as she worked, so close she could smell the leather of his vest and the faint scent of shaving soap. "You look different tonight, happier." Lillian paused, surprised by his observation. "I met Laura Jennings today. I'm going to mind her baby sometimes." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "That'll be good for you both, I expect." "Yes," she agreed softly, finishing with his cut and moving to his bruised hand. She held it gently, dabbing at the broken skin on his knuckles. His hand was large, calloused from work, and warm beneath her fingers. "Why didn't you ever marry?" she asked suddenly, then felt her cheeks flush at her boldness. Matthew didn't seem offended by the question. "Came close once, about 10 years back. She decided a lawman's wife sees too many lonely nights and worrisome days." He flexed his fingers slightly in her grasp. "Then I got busy with the badge and the years just went by." "You're not so old," Lillian said, releasing his hand and folding the cloth. 37 next month," he replied with a wry smile. "Ancient by some standards out here." "Experienced," she corrected, and was rewarded with another of those genuine smiles that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Experienced enough to know when a woman's trying to change the subject from herself," he countered. "How are you really doing, Lillian? And don't tell me fine like you do Rebecca." The directness of his gaze made evasion impossible. "Some days are better than others," she admitted. "Some nights I dream of holding my baby, and wake up with my arms empty. Other days, I almost forget what I've lost." "The doc could be wrong," Matthew suggested gently. Lillian shook her head. He was quite certain, and even if there was a chance. She trailed off, looking down at her hands. What man would want to take that risk? "A man who wanted you more than he wanted children," Matthew said, his voice low and serious. When she looked up, the intensity in his eyes stole her breath. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to be wanted by a man like Matthew Fletcher, strong, steady, kind beneath his weathered exterior. The sound of breaking glass from the parlor shattered the moment. Rebecca's sharp voice called for assistance, and Matthew sighed as he rose. "Duty calls," he said, but he touched Lillian's shoulder briefly before walking away, a gentle pressure that felt like a promise. September brought relief from the heat and the welcome arrival of the autumn cattle drives. The boarding house filled with cowboys passing through, and Lillian found herself busier than ever. Between the store, the boarding house, and her twice-weekly afternoons with baby Levy, she had little time for melancholy thoughts. One afternoon, as Lillian sat on the Jennings front porch rocking Levy while Laura helped at the forge, she looked up to find Matthew watching her from the street. He removed his hat and approached the porch steps. "He suits you," he commented, nodding toward the sleeping baby in her arms. "He's a sweet-natured boy," Lillian replied softly. "Would you like to hold him?" Matthew looked startled by the offer. "Been a while since I held one this small, not since Rebecca's boy, and he's 15 now." "You won't break him," Lillian assured him, standing and carefully transferring the baby to Matthew's arms. The sight of the infant cradled against the Marshal's broad chest did something peculiar to Lillian's heart. Matthew's expression softened as he looked down at the sleeping child, one large finger gently stroking Levy's cheek. "Makes you think, doesn't it?" he said quietly. "All the possibilities wrapped up in something so small." "Yes," Lillian agreed, unable to take her eyes from the tableau before her. "It does." Matthew looked up then, meeting her gaze, and something unspoken passed between them, a shared understanding, perhaps, or a mutual longing for things that might not be. The baby stirred and began to fuss, breaking the moment. Lillian took him back, soothing him with practiced ease. "I actually came looking for you," Matthew said, replacing his hat. "Got a letter for you at the office. Return address says Boston." Lillian's heart skipped. "My aunt lives in Boston. It must be from her." "I'll bring it by the boarding house this evening," he promised, then tipped his hat and continued on his rounds. That night, after the boarders had been fed and the kitchen cleaned, Lillian sat at the small desk in her room, reading her aunt's letter with trembling hands. "Dearest Lillian, I was relieved beyond measure to receive your letter and learn you survived that terrible ordeal. While I grieve with you over the doctor's prognosis, I must remind you that a woman's worth is not measured solely by her ability to bear children. Your mother raised you to be resourceful and strong-willed, traits that will serve you well in your new life. I've enclosed a bank draft for $50. It isn't much, but perhaps it will help you establish yourself properly in this town you've described. If you wish to return east, our home is always open to you, though I understand if the Arizona territory has begun to claim your heart. With deepest affection, Aunt Margaret enclosed was indeed a bank draft, enough money to purchase a train ticket east if she wished, or to secure more permanent lodgings in Willowcreek. Lillian sat back, considering her options. 3 months ago, she would have taken the money and fled back east without hesitation. Now, the thought of leaving brought a different kind of pain. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Opening it, she found Matthew standing in the dim hallway, hat in hand. "Rebecca said you'd come up already," he explained. "I wanted to make sure you got your letter." "I did, thank you." She hesitated, then stepped back. "Would you like to come in?" "It's not proper, I know, but nothing proper about most of what happens in this territory," he said with a small smile, entering the room but leaving the door ajar for propriety's sake. Lillian returned to her chair while Matthew remained standing, looking slightly too large for the small space. "Good news from Boston?" he asked, nodding toward the letter. "My aunt sent money," Lillian explained. "Enough to go back east if I wanted." Something flickered in Matthew's eyes, concern perhaps, or disappointment. "And do you want to go back?" Lillian looked around the simple room that had become her home. "I'm not sure anymore. 3 months ago I would have said yes without hesitation, but now—" "Now," he prompted when she trailed off. "Now I have work that matters, friends, a place where I'm needed." She met his gaze steadily. "Reasons to stay?" Matthew took a step closer, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "What kind of reasons?" Lillian's heart pounded as she stood to face him. "You know what kind, Matthew." For a moment, neither moved. Then Matthew closed the remaining distance between them, one hand coming up to gently touch her cheek. "I've been trying not to hope," he admitted roughly. "Figured a young woman like you would want a man with better prospects, a whole future, not just a badge and a rented room above the jailhouse." "I don't care about prospects," Lillian whispered, leaning into his touch. "I care about the man who carried me to the doctor when I was bleeding in the street, who found me work and a place to stay, who looks at me like I'm whole, even when I don't feel that way myself." Matthew's thumb brushed her cheekbone, his eyes searching hers. "You are whole, Lillian. Everything that matters is right here." His hand slid down to rest above her heart. When he finally kissed her, it was gentle, a question more than a demand. Lillian answered by winding her arms around his neck, drawing him closer as the kiss deepened. His arms encircled her waist, strong and secure. And for the first time since the doctor's grim pronouncement, Lillian felt something inside her begin to heal. A creak in the hallway reminded them of their surroundings. Matthew stepped back reluctantly, though he kept hold of her hands. "I should go," he said, his voice husky, "before Rebecca comes up here with her broom." Lillian smiled, feeling light-headed and strangely powerful. "Will I see you tomorrow? Count on it," he promised, bringing her fingers to his lips before releasing them. "We have things to discuss." After he left, Lillian stood by the window, watching as he crossed the yard below. When he reached the gate, he looked up as though sensing her gaze and tipped his hat. She raised her hand in return, a gesture that felt like sealing a pact. That night, for the first time in months, Lillian didn't dream of what she'd lost. Instead, she dreamed of possibilities. The next few weeks passed in a blur of shared glances, stolen moments, and the delicious tension of a courtship conducted under Rebecca's watchful eye. Matthew took to escorting Lillian to and from the general store, their conversations ranging from childhood memories to hopes for the future. He never pressed her about her plans, but his presence made the choice increasingly clear. One crisp October evening, Matthew invited Lillian for a ride outside town. Rebecca provided a chaperone in the form of her teenage son, who trailed behind them at a discreet distance as they rode along the creek that gave the town its name. "Place used to be greener," Matthew explained as they dismounted near a cluster of cottonwoods. "Droughts hit hard the last few years, but it'll come back." They spread a blanket beneath the trees while Rebecca's son fished half-heartedly upstream, clearly bored with his assignment. "I used to come here when I first took the marshal's job," Matthew continued, sitting beside Lillian. "Town was rougher then. Needed a place to clear my head." "It's peaceful," Lillian agreed, watching the water glint in the late afternoon sun. Matthew seemed uncharacteristically nervous, fidgeting with his hat before setting it aside. "I've been thinking," he began, "about what you said that night in your room about having reasons to stay." Lillian's heart quickened. "Yes. I'm not a wealthy man," he said, taking her hand. "Got some savings, enough for a small place outside town. Been looking at the old Miller property. House needs work, but the land's good. Creek runs through the back corner." "Matthew," Lillian said softly, "are you asking me something?" He met her gaze directly. "I'm asking if you'd consider being my wife, Lillian. I know what the doctor said, and I want you to know it doesn't matter to me. If it's just the two of us, that's enough. If by some miracle it's more, then that's a blessing." Tears welled in Lillian's eyes, not of sorrow but of a joy so acute it bordered on pain. "You truly don't mind?" "About children," Matthew's hand came up to brush away a tear that had escaped. "The only thing I mind is the thought of you leaving. Everything else we can face together." "Then yes," Lillian whispered, leaning into his touch. "Yes, I'll marry you." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, transforming his weathered face. When he kissed her, there was no hesitation, only certainty and promise. Lillian melted into him, feeling as though she'd finally found her way home after a long, difficult journey. The sound of someone pointedly clearing their throat reminded them they weren't alone. Rebecca's son stood a few yards away, looking everywhere but at them. "Ma said to remind you it'll be dark soon," he mumbled. Matthew laughed, keeping his arm around Lillian as they rose. "Tell your ma we're heading back," he called, "and that she should start planning a wedding." News of their engagement spread quickly through Willowcreek. Most reactions were positive. The townsfolk had grown fond of Lillian and respected their marshal. A few raised eyebrows at the match, particularly when whispers about Lillian's condition circulated, but Matthew silenced such talk with a steely glare. Mrs. Whittaker insisted on hosting a small engagement gathering at her home, and even Dr. Peterson offered congratulations when they passed on the street. "Marriage agrees with most patients," he said gruffly. "Good for the Constitution." Rebecca, after her initial surprise, proved to be an enthusiastic supporter of the match. "Never thought he'd settle down," she confided to Lillian as they prepared for the wedding. "Too married to that badge. You must be something special to change his mind." The wedding took place in mid-November, a simple ceremony in the town's small church. Lillian wore a new blue dress that Laura Jennings helped her sew, with lace collar and cuffs ordered specially from the catalog. Matthew looked uncommonly handsome in a new black suit, his badge polished to a high shine on his chest. As they exchanged vows before the minister and the assembled townsfolk, Lillian felt a sense of rightness wash over her. The path that had led her here, the missed connection with her original intended, the terrible injury, the long recovery suddenly seemed less like tragedy and more like destiny. The reception at the boarding house was a lively affair, with music from a fiddle player and enough food to feed half the territory. As evening fell, Matthew led his bride away from the celebration to a waiting buggy. "Where are we going?" Lillian asked as he helped her up. "Home," he said simply, and drove them to the property he'd mentioned, the old Miller place just outside town. In the weeks before the wedding, Matthew had worked tirelessly to make the small house habitable. The front room boasted new curtains and a rag rug before the hearth. A table and chairs stood in the kitchen area, and a large bed with a colorful quilt dominated the bedroom. "It's not much," Matthew said as he carried her over the threshold, "but it's ours." "It's perfect," Lillian assured him, taking in the evidence of his labor: the fresh whitewash on the walls, the mended floorboards, the clean windows letting in moonlight. That night, as they became truly husband and wife, Lillian's fears about her damaged body faded beneath Matthew's gentle, reverent touch. He kissed the scar on her side, a visible reminder of what she'd lost, and whispered against her skin, "Beautiful, all of you." In his arms, she felt whole again, her body awakening to sensations she'd never imagined. When tears came, tears of release and healing, Matthew kissed them away, his own eyes suspiciously bright in the darkness. "I love you," he told her, words she'd never expected to hear directed at her again. "Every part of you, Lillian Fletcher." "And I love you," she whispered back, holding him close as their bodies and hearts became one. Life as Mrs. Fletcher brought new rhythms and responsibilities. Lillian continued working at the general store 3 days a week, but now she returned home to their own house rather than the boarding house. She learned to manage their household, plant a kitchen garden, and even handle the revolver Matthew insisted she keep when he was away on Marshal business. Their evenings were spent together by the fire, talking or reading or simply existing in comfortable silence. On nights when Matthew had to patrol, Lillian would wait up for him, relief washing over her each time she heard his boots on the porch steps. The physical side of their marriage proved to be a revelation for both of them. Matthew was a considerate lover, attuned to Lillian's responses and dedicated to her pleasure. The intimacy they shared healed something in Lillian that went deeper than physical wounds, a belief that she was somehow less of a woman because of what had happened. Christmas came, their first as husband and wife, celebrated with simple gifts and a dinner shared with Rebecca and her son. As they walked home through gently falling snow, Matthew's arm around her waist, Lillian felt a contentment she hadn't thought possible a year earlier. "Happy?" he asked, reading her expression in the moonlight. "More than I ever imagined I could be," she answered truthfully. Winter passed in a blur of domestic happiness, punctuated by the occasional crisis requiring the Marshal's attention. Lillian continued caring for baby Levy when Laura needed help, finding that her love for the child enhanced rather than diminished her joy in her marriage. In late February, as winter began to loosen its grip on the territory, Lillian fell ill. At first, she dismissed it as a winter chill, but when the nausea persisted for over a week, Matthew insisted she see Dr. Peterson. "Probably just a stomach ailment," she assured him as they walked to the doctor's office together. "Or perhaps I'm not used to my own cooking yet." Matthew squeezed her hand. "Humor me. I've seen too many folks ignore symptoms until it's too late, Doctor." Peterson's examination was thorough, his questions direct and sometimes embarrassingly personal. When he finished, he sat back and regarded Lillian with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said slowly, "when was your last monthly cycle?" Lillian blinked, mentally calculating. With the wedding preparations and setting up their home, she hadn't paid much attention. "December, I think." "Why?" Dr. Peterson glanced at Matthew, who had insisted on staying in the room. "Because against all medical probability, you appear to be with child." The words didn't register at first. When they did, Lillian felt the room spin around her. "That's impossible," she whispered. "You said—" "I said the damage was extensive," Dr. Peterson corrected. "Apparently, I overestimated its completeness. It's rare, but not unheard of. The body has remarkable healing capabilities, especially in the young." Lillian looked to Matthew, whose expression had transformed from concern to wonder. "A baby?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Due in late August or early September by my calculation," the doctor confirmed. "I must caution you, Mrs. Fletcher, this pregnancy may be difficult. The scarring could complicate matters as the child grows." But Lillian barely heard the warnings. A baby. Their baby. The impossible made possible. Tears spilled down her cheeks as Matthew knelt beside her chair, taking both her hands in his. "Lily," he said, using the endearment he'd adopted in their most private moments, "we're going to have a child." The joy in his face was unmistakable, but so was the concern. "Are you all right?" "Is this too much?" "It's everything," she whispered, leaning forward to press her forehead against his. "Everything I thought I'd lost." That night, as they lay in bed, Matthew's hand rested protectively over her still flat stomach. "I meant what I said before we married," he told her. "If it had just been the two of us, that would have been enough." "I know," Lillian said, covering his hand with hers, "but this feels like a miracle." "You're the miracle," Matthew replied, kissing her softly. "The baby is just proof of it." As spring arrived, Lillian's condition became more apparent. The town buzzed with the news, some expressing genuine happiness for the couple, others whispering about medical miracles with knowing looks. Lillian ignored the latter, too filled with joy to care about gossip. Dr. Peterson monitored her closely, concerned about the strain on her damaged tissues. "Bed rest may become necessary as you progress," he warned during one examination. "The scar tissue doesn't stretch as normal tissue would." Lillian took his caution seriously, adjusting her activities as her body changed. She reluctantly gave up her position at the general store, but Mrs. Whittaker brought the books to her home weekly, allowing her to continue managing the accounts from her parlor. Matthew became even more protective, arranging for a deputy to handle night patrols so he could be home with his wife. He built a cradle from pine boards, smoothing the wood until it felt like satin beneath Lillian's approving touch. "Boy or girl?" he asked one evening as they sat on their porch, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. "Girl," Lillian said without hesitation, "with your eyes and stubborn chin." Matthew laughed. "Boy," he countered, "with your brains and kind heart." "We'll see who's right in a few months," she said, leaning against his shoulder. As Lillian's pregnancy progressed, the discomfort increased. The scar on her side stretched painfully as the baby grew, and by July, Dr. Peterson insisted on complete bed rest. "The strain on the damaged tissue is considerable," he explained. "We need to minimize the risk of tearing." Being confined to bed during the hottest part of summer was its own special torment, but Lillian endured it stoically. Rebecca visited daily, bringing gossip and company. Laura Jennings came too, with little Levy, now walking and chattering. Matthew rearranged his schedule to spend as much time as possible at home, often reading to Lillian from novels ordered specially from back east. At night, he would talk to their unborn child, his deep voice rumbling against Lillian's swollen belly as he shared stories of his day or plans for the future. "Going to teach you to ride," he promised one night, "and fish in the creek. Your mama is going to teach you letters and numbers, make you the smartest child in the territory." Lillian stroked his hair as he spoke, memorizing the moment her husband's tenderness, the active movement of their child beneath her skin, the perfect contentment of being exactly where she was meant to be. August arrived with relentless heat and increased discomfort. Dr. Peterson visited every other day, his expression growing more concerned as he noted the strain on Lillian's scar tissue. "The baby is positioned properly," he assured them, "but I'm worried about your ability to labor normally, Mrs. Fletcher. The scar tissue could rupture under the strain." "What does that mean?" Matthew demanded, his hand tightening around Lillian's. "It means we may need to consider surgical intervention when the time comes," the doctor said gravely. "It's a risky procedure, but it may be the safest option for both mother and child." The possibility hung over them like a storm cloud in the weeks that followed. Lillian tried to focus on the joy of impending motherhood rather than the dangers, but fear crept in during quiet moments, fear not for herself, but for the miracle child she carried. On the night of August 27th, Lillian woke to a sharp, tearing pain in her side. Her gasp brought Matthew instantly awake. "The baby?" he asked, already reaching for his clothes. "Something's wrong," Lillian managed through gritted teeth. "It's not like the practice pains, it's my side, the scar." Matthew didn't waste time with questions. He wrapped her in a blanket, lifted her carefully, and carried her to the buggy he'd kept ready for weeks. The ride to town was agonizing, each bump in the road sending fresh waves of pain through Lillian's body. Dr. Peterson was waiting, alerted by a neighbor Matthew had pounded on the door of as they passed. The examination was brief and grim. "The scar tissue has begun to tear," he confirmed. "We need to deliver this baby now, or we risk losing both of you." Lillian looked to Matthew, whose face had gone pale beneath his tan. "Do whatever you must," she told the doctor, "but save our child." "I intend to save you both," Dr. Peterson replied, already rolling up his sleeves. "Marshal, I'll need your assistance and steady hands. Mrs. Peterson will prepare the patient." What followed was a blur of pain and fear for Lillian. She remembered the sweet, cloying smell of chloroform, Matthew's face above hers as she drifted into unconsciousness, his lips moving in what might have been a prayer. When she woke, the room was quiet except for a soft, rhythmic breathing beside her. Turning her head with effort, Lillian saw Matthew slouched in a chair by her bed, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle as he slept. In his arms, wrapped in a white blanket, was a tiny bundle. "Matthew," she whispered, her mouth dry as cotton. He startled awake immediately, relief washing over his features as their eyes met. "Lily," he breathed. "You're awake." "The baby?" she asked, fear clutching at her heart. In answer, Matthew stood and carefully placed the bundle in her arms. Lillian looked down into a perfectly formed face, rosebud lips, button nose, and a wisp of dark hair. "Your daughter," Matthew said, his voice rough with emotion. "Born just after midnight. Dr. Peterson says she's strong and healthy, despite arriving a bit early." Tears blurred Lillian's vision as she counted tiny fingers and toes, marveling at the miracle in her arms. "She's perfect," she whispered. "Like her mother," Matthew agreed, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "You gave us quite a scare, Lily. Doc says it was close." Lillian could see the shadows of fear still lingering in his eyes. "But we're both all right now. You will be." The tear was bad, but Peterson managed to repair it. "Says you'll need plenty of rest and time to heal." Matthew's finger gently stroked the baby's cheek. "Worth every moment of worry, though, isn't she?" The baby yawned, her tiny mouth forming a perfect O, and Lillian felt her heart expand with a love so powerful it seemed impossible to contain. "What shall we call her?" Matthew smiled. "I thought perhaps Margaret, after your aunt who sent the money that kept you in Willowcreek." "Margaret," Lillian repeated, testing the name. "Maggie for short." "Maggie Fletcher," Matthew agreed. "Sounds like a force to be reckoned with." As if in agreement, the baby opened her eyes dark blue like all newborns, but with a hint of the green gold Lillian suspected they would become, like her father's. The following weeks were a blend of exhaustion and exhilaration as Lillian recovered from her surgery and adjusted to motherhood. Matthew took a leave from his marshal duties, hiring his deputy full-time until Lillian was stronger. He proved to be an attentive father, as comfortable changing nappies as he was facing down outlaws. By the time autumn painted the cottonwoods gold, Lillian was well enough to sit on their porch with Maggie in her arms, watching Matthew split firewood for the coming winter. Their daughter thrived, growing plumper by the day, her eyes indeed turning the same changeable green gold as her father's. "Dr. Peterson says you've healed remarkably well," Matthew commented one evening as they prepared for bed, Maggie already asleep in her cradle. "I feel stronger every day," Lillian confirmed, brushing out her hair. Matthew watched her from the bed, his expression thoughtful. He also said, "That is, he mentioned that another child wouldn't be impossible. Risky, but not impossible." Lillian set down her brush and turned to face him. "Are you asking if I want another baby?" "I'm saying that I would understand if you didn't," Matthew clarified. "Maggie is more than I ever hoped for in watching you suffer through that birth." He shook his head. "I wouldn't ask you to risk it again." Lillian crossed to the bed and sat beside him, taking his hand. "Matthew Fletcher, when I married you, I had made peace with never having children. Now we have our beautiful daughter, a true miracle." She squeezed his fingers. "If God blesses us with another child someday, we'll face the risks together. If not, our family is already perfect." Matthew pulled her into his arms, his kiss a mixture of tenderness and passion that still made her heart race. "How did I get so lucky?" he murmured against her hair. "I ask myself the same question every day," Lillian replied, melting into his embrace. 2 years later, on a crisp spring morning, Lillian stood in the doorway of their expanded home, watching Matthew chase a giggling Maggie around the yard. Their daughter's dark curls bounced as she ran, her father deliberately slowing his pace to allow her the thrill of escape. Lillian's hand rested on her gently rounded stomach, where their second miracle grew. This pregnancy had come as a surprise, nearly 3 years after Maggie's birth, when they'd begun to believe their family was complete as it was. Dr. Peterson had been cautiously optimistic. "The previous surgery and your body's remarkable healing give me hope," he'd said. "But we'll monitor you closely, just as before." As she watched her husband scoop up their laughing daughter and spin her around, Lillian felt a profound gratitude for the path that had brought her here, even the painful parts. The stray bullet that had seemingly destroyed her hopes of motherhood had ultimately led her to Matthew, and to a joy more complete than she had ever imagined possible. "Mama," Maggie called, spotting her in the doorway. "Come play." "Coming, sweetheart," Lillian called back, stepping into the sunshine to join her family. As Matthew's arm circled her waist, his hand coming to rest protectively over hers on her stomach, Lillian thought of the frightened, broken young woman who had arrived in Willowcreek 4 years earlier. How could she have known that her greatest wound would lead to her greatest healing? That a marshal with kind eyes would see beyond her scars to the woman beneath? That tears kissed away could truly be transformed into joy, happy? Matthew asked softly, echoing the question he'd asked on their first Christmas together. Lillian smiled up at him, her heart full to overflowing. "Completely," she answered, standing on tiptoe to kiss him as their daughter danced around them in the golden Arizona sunlight, a perfect testament to the power of love and second chances in the wild, wonderful West.